see you guys in the dark.
Being a paramedic means spending 99% of your time doing mundane, routine work, involving transporting patients who aren't actually sick to and from the hospitals and their appointments. The other 1% seeing things that most humans never see, and pretending that you've seen these things 100 times before and know exactly what to do about them. So this is exactly what I expected for my first day on the job. I had just finished my theory training, and it was my first day on the job. I started at 0700 and met my training paramedic officer. I was young, naive, eager to learn, and all too concerned with checking the ambulance before we got the first big job. My training paramedic officer was concerned with making a good cup of coffee and sitting down to read his newspaper. Before we were rudely interrupted with this big job, at 0705, the phone had rang. John, my training paramedic officer, looked over at my excited expression and said that'll be the sign-on call, but it wasn't. We were called to a 16-year-old boy found unconscious in the backyard after apparently being involved in the consumption of a lot of alcohol the night before, not breathing and without any pulse, while his brother was attempting CPR. John looked at me. Okay, here's your orientation to driving lights and the sirens. As the passenger, your job is to watch for cars coming from the intersections on the left. Acknowledge whether to clear or to stop if you think a car is not going to stop. I'm not going to be looking on the left side, so if you want to avoid being hit by a car on your side, you better pay attention. I paid a lot of attention. As we rapidly progressed through the busy city streets, lights and sirens were blaring. I felt as though I was on a roller coaster ride for the first time in my life, and unable to interpret all the information that appeared to be buzzing in from all the directions, overtaking cars, trucks, cyclists, you name it. Driving through red lights and listening to the multitude of cars driving by people not yet fully awake, who are honking their horns in complaint of the vehicle in front, which has stopped, for no apparent reason. Oblivious to the ambulance desperately making its way through. Trying to weave our way through a large procession of early morning, city-dwelling pedestrians on their way to work, with iPods in their ears, blissfully ignorant of the ambulance desperately trying to get through. John looks over at me. Do you acknowledge all of that? I feel like I've fallen asleep, and just woken up in the middle of giving a speech at the point in which I'm about to identify the brilliant solution, completely unaware of what I was meant to say. Acknowledge what? I ask him. John looks over at me very calmly. Weren't you paying attention to the radio? While trying to interpret all the other excessive information, my ears didn't mention to me that dispatch was giving me specific information about my patient. After all, I was still trying to remember how to set up the resuscitation equipment. John grabbed the radio, and then acknowledged all the information. Suddenly, the ride had stopped. We were at the scene. There was a neighbor urgently waving both hands, as though his urging could somehow speed up our presence. We grabbed our gear, and followed the man around the backyard. In the middle of the yard, we found a young man stiff as a rock, cold, and very clearly deceased from the night before. My training paramedic started to explain to me that this patient had obviously died during the night, and then proceeded to place the cardiac monitor dots on the patient. This was part of our policy with any deceased patient to ensure that he or she was actually dead. We did this even in patients who had clearly been dead for some time, and no amount of resuscitation efforts could ever help bring them back. To our surprise, the monitor starts to beep. The rhythm was almost completely normal. My training paramedic looked at me, as though somehow I had made a mistake putting on the ECG dots, as though it might be my fault, because obviously this patient was dead, and there could be no electrical activity anymore. No, the monitor doesn't lie. This person's heart was still firing its normal electrical currents, but the heart just wasn't doing what it's supposed to, and it wasn't actually beating. We immediately start CPR, with me doing chest compression, and my training paramedic ventilating the patient. The intensive care paramedics then arrived, and while one of them inserted the ETD tube into the patient's trachea to breathe for him, another paramedic had started to insert adrenaline into the jugular. Within 5 minutes, the patient heart spontaneously started to beat on its own, and the patient had a good, strong pulse. We quickly loaded the patient into the ambulance. He started to moan, and then with both arms reached for the ET tube. Everyone talks about ambulance miracles, and this appeared to be one of them, because this guy was originally dead. I mean, his arms were that rigid when we got there that he couldn't move them at all. And now we were fighting him and trying to tell him not to pull the tube out because it was helping him. About 5 minutes from the hospital, the ambulance miracle ceased, and the monitor shows that the patient is now dead. He flatlined, like in the movies. CPR is immediately commenced, and the intensive care paramedic says to me, "This is your baptism of fire, mate. Every paramedic's got to learn to do CPR in the back of a moving ambulance at one stage." The patient's condition remained unchanged. At the hospital, the medical team continued to work on the patient for another half hour and then pronounced him dead. I talked to the training paramedic while I was given the rookie job of cleaning the ambulance and resetting up all the equipment, and asked what he thought had happened to the young man. "Mate, there's another lesson for you. Sometimes the strangest things happen in this job, and that's all there is to it. No explanation, no rhyme or reason why one patient dies and another one gets to live." We responded to an apartment building when the caretaker had called us. The initial report was that he went to go check on a suite because water had been reported flooding into the hallway. He informed us that there was a deceased lady in the tub. He said that he saw her and immediately backed out without touching anything. We entered the suite, and it was filled with steam. The humidity had started peeling the paint off the walls and sheets. There was also the smell of cooked meat. Upon entering the bathroom, we found the supposed deceased seated in the tub, with the hot water running. From the looks of it, she had been there for a while. The skin on her body, all the way from the toes, had started separating, much like the paint on the walls. It was bubbled and coming up in sheets. I checked for vitals while someone turned off the water, and the other ones went to go get a bag and a radio for a can. When the body is completely decomposed, we put them in a sheet metal box. I almost shit myself when I found signs of life. The lady happened to have a pulse. She wasn't really responsive, but she was breathing shallow, had a heartbeat, and was looking at us. We had to get her out of there. We radioed for EMS and informed them we had a live patient with at least 80% burn. They were a few minutes out, and we started to get the patient ready for transport. I don't remember what we were doing when we noticed the water draining from the tub, but we saw was her torso essentially gloving itself as the water had receded. We immediately plugged the bathtub and then continued working her. When EMS arrived, we had to transfer her to the stretcher. That's where things got pretty ugly. Well, I planned to gently lift her out of the tub and place her on the stretcher. However, as soon as we touched her, her skin was coming off in sheets. I remember saying, "I'm sorry, but we have to do this," as I picked up my section and came away with almost all of the skin I contacted stuck to my arms. That was the only time that she made any sound. She probably couldn't feel it due to the nerve damage, but I'm pretty sure she knew she had almost lost all of her skin from the chest down. The water was still extremely hot, so we were also getting burned while doing this. We managed to get her onto the stretcher, and EMS had taken her away. When the bathtub was drained, there was a sheet of it stuck to the bottom. We had to scrape it off and bag it. I still can't eat certain chicken dishes because of this. We figured she was in the tub, and water got cool, so she turned it on with her toes, but she must have had a stroke and couldn't turn it off once again. Being an apartment, it had pretty much unlimited hot water, so that poor lady sat there for approximately 3 days, just cooking. She did not survive. We don't get a lot of follow-up calls, but I heard that she had passed away. Between a stroke and severe burns, it wasn't likely that she would make it, but we treat every patient like they have a chance. The human body is a weird and wonderful thing. Sometimes people do make it through some pretty terrible things. I had a call just after I came on duty of an elderly male with possible high fever. We didn't have much more information because of the caller, which was his elderly wife, was, according to the dispatcher, hard to understand. Anyways, we head out there 7 minutes or so later. As we get in, The wife is sitting at the kitchen table just inside the door, so we ask her what's going on. She answers that he has been complaining. He is too hot all morning. We go into the next room, which is dark due to the curtains covering the windows, but there is enough light to see a dead man sitting in a chair. Now, mind you, he was not recently dead. I'm talking blackened face, rot, rat bites around the mouth. Wasn't complaining this morning type of dead. I set down my equipment, and my partner goes to turn on the light next to his chair so we can verify the obvious. As she goes to reach for the light, the dead man groans and reaches for her hand. After collectively shitting our pants, we jump into action. Come to find out he was on oxygen and a smoker. He was complaining about being hot because he was literally burning up. What looked like signs of death on his face were scorch marks and melted plastic. To answer the obvious question, I don't know. He was still alive when we got him in the hospital, and I never asked what happened to him after that. I work as an ICU nurse. A mid-20s female came in with some serious cardiac abnormalities and went into respiratory distress. Never had any medical history at all. We had to put her on the ventilator, but she was just enough sedated to keep her lucid. She could nod or shake her head yes and no, apparently to questions. One night the patient in the room next to hers had died, and the body was still in the room about to be taken to the morgue. The female patient's door was closed with the curtains drawn, so she couldn't have seen what was going on next door. When I went in to check on her, she had a look of sheer panic on her face, and trembling. I asked her a series of questions to see if she was cold, hot, in pain, stuff like that, and she denied all of it. I asked her if she saw something. She started to aggressively nod her head yes. She wasn't on any drugs that would make her hallucinate. I went on to get details on what this thing looked like. After playing 20 questions, I got this. It was a man, pale white, left arm was missing, heavy, bald, standing still, right behind me. This was the man who had just died next door. I had spent the rest of the night consoling her. I live in the southern United States, and I am a paramedic. Since I was in high school, I've been involved with emergency medical services and the volunteer fire service. During that time, I have seen many things that I can't explain, even till this day. I had a ton of exposure of anger and violence towards everyone that I came across. I have been attacked in many ways by mental patients who did not want to be held down, even plowed by patients. I have been stabbed by a guy with a needle during a DUI check. This incident was much worse, though. My partner almost got hurt, and nothing was done about this guy attacking us. It was sometime in November. I worked for a popular ambulance company for a little while. We worked around the area of Tennessee. It was fun doing what I did. Usually we had a call or two a day, taking the sick or the hurt to the hospital. Many calls would deal with drugs, sometimes even domestic violence cases. The night was dark and rainy. We were called to assist a 911 call. We heard over the intercom that the woman was not responsive, so we sped off that way. We usually worked with EMTs. That night, we had a 6-month pregnant EMT. She was about 5'2", a very sweet person. I'm 5'5", and I usually crack jokes about things to lighten the mood. I knew something was strange the moment that we arrived. This neighborhood was an older neighborhood with shotgun houses. The only light to the house was the light coming from the cop car. A deputy happened to be at the door, saying that the lady was inside, and had all the other cops at their cars away from the house. The lady's husband came home, found his wife on the ground, so he called the police department for some help. Said his brother did it, and then he vanished. Back to his car. We walk in, and no one was around except for the lady, laying face down between the couch and the table. The woman had a busted nose and a split head. We went to work immediately. She had bruises that were both new and old all over her. We had work to do. We had to give her an IV and a neck collar so that she would not be able to move. Without us knowing, a man suddenly stepped out of the bathroom. I gave her a mask and was checking her when I hear the clicks from a shotgun. My partner was working on the stretcher outside. I stood up and came face to face with a shotgun, and the man staring right at me. The man was black and seemed drunk, with a pissed-off look on his face. He looked at me and just repeated, "I will get them all." He was sweaty and jittery with the smell of alcohol on his breath. Even with my training of, if it isn't safe, just leave. And if that was a possibility, he probably would have tried to kill me. I told the EMT to get out now. She probably saw this because she screamed. I repeated it slowly as I placed myself over his wife and my partner. He suddenly put the gun to my face and had no emotion to his face. The EMT took off down the road. He repeated, "I will get them and kill them. Did you do this?" I figured that it was just a joke and told him jokingly to not miss. He didn't laugh as he held the gun at me. I tried not to break down as I told him that I'm the only one that can save her. "If she dies, so do you," he responded, as he sat down on the couch. I figured that I was going to die here. I worked to bandage up the woman, and when I look up, he would blast me is all that I thought. He suddenly lowered the gun, said that his brother made him do this, that she was cheating on me. He made me do it. I just didn't want this to happen, you see, but she made me. I was running out of ways to make him think that I could save her when flashlights flooded my eyes. The police were brought back by my partner. She noticed that they went in search for the brother. Guns had drawn. They yelled for him to drop the gun. He did, and they threw him onto the ground and cuffed him. They made him drop the gun before putting in handcuffs. All he said was that it was my brother. It was my brother's fault. I was shaking in fear. We got her bandaged up and delivered her to the trauma center. When we met back with the deputy, we made a report with him and the company. Nothing was said after that. I don't work there anymore, and sometimes I see the EMT. I laugh about the situation from time to time with her. Thank God nothing was said on the news about it. I was taking a kid when I see her. She takes me aside and lets me know the rest of what has happened. Then I realized how close I really was to death. When the woman came through, she told everyone that her husband didn't take his meds and drank heavily that day. He assaulted her until she was knocked out on the floor. Claimed that she was cheating with his brother, and he knew it. Eventually, he had pleaded guilty and was taken away. He is still locked up to this day. The thing is that his brother died years before in an accident. At least that's what the wife has told us. He took the meds to stop his hallucinations of his brother. The cops knew of the calls for mental illness at that house and never said a word to us. I have more questions than answers right now, and at this point, I am sure that I will never have them answered. What's the worst thing that you've ever seen? Ask any paramedic, and they'll have been asked this question many times over in their career. I'd never given myself time to properly think about the answer until recently. Is it having my fingers in the back of a teenage boy's brain as my colleague and I lift his limp body into a bag after he had flipped over his new car on a dark country road? Is it looking upon a small, water-thin, dead child curled up on her Cinderella duvet after drinking her parents' medication that they used to help with their addictions? Is it the elderly man who closed curtains had gone unnoticed by his busy neighbors while he lay decomposing in his own carpet? It's none of these. My answer starts at 6:10 a.m. one morning many years ago with a call out to an elderly man who is struggling to breathe. Treating a dying child made me reflect on my role as a paramedic. We arrived at a slightly neglected bungalow where a frail elderly figure limps slowly to the door, greets us with an apology. She didn't want to bother us. Her husband is slumped in front of the room. I know he's not well, and he needs to go to the hospital. The woman who answered the door is visibly shaken on hearing this news, but she finds solace in starting preparations for her beloved husband, Bert, to leave for the hospital. He needs clean pajamas and toothbrush, and after fondly rubbing his chin, he will need his razor too. I give Bert some oxygen and start to think that if we don't get him to the ambulance quick, he will collapse. Mavis, his wife, returns tearful with her husband's belongings. I talked to her to try to convey the seriousness and urgency of the situation. Bert is stoic in his responses, telling his wife he will be fine, but he is kind too. Reminded Mavis of how much he loves her. Mavis is proud. They have been married for more than 60 years, she says, as she ambles away again. I look around the room at faded photos of many generations of their family. He tells me that they are all dead now, even their son who died young. I talk with him and reassure him that we are going to the hospital soon. She is the love of my life, he says, between tiring breaths. There has never been anyone else. I remember his soft, slow words perfectly, and the telling look in his eyes. He knows he's not coming home again. I worry that we are taking too long. He needs to be in the hospital quickly. I don't want him to die in my ambulance. His wife is elderly and frail, and accompanying her husband to the hospital isn't an option. I worry that there is no one to come to help her when we are gone. My haste to get Bert out of the door and to the hospital is abruptly subdued by the realization that this is probably their final moment together. They are about to say goodbye to each other for the very last time. I try to convey the gravity of the situation to Mavis. I think she finally understands when her eyes fill up. She limps back towards Bert, who is still protesting to her that he will be fine. Her hands cup his cheeks as her small, stooped frame leans forward to give him a kiss. I pause momentarily, trying to be invisible, and then ask quietly if we can go. She flattens his hair to one side of his head, smiles at me, and then nods her head. I ask him if that is okay, and he smiles and nods too. He died later that day, and I spent a lot of time wondering what happened to Mavis. I knew that I had cared for Bert and looked after him well, but I had deserted her. I had left her there all alone. I toyed with the idea of visiting her to go check up on her. This felt right in many ways, but wrong in others too. I didn't know what to do. I had prioritized Bert's care, but in doing so, I had neglected what she needed. I was left feeling like I had failed her in many ways. When thinking about my answer to the "what's the worst thing that you've ever seen?" it didn't take me long to remember this job, even though it happened many years ago. It is the job that I most agonized over. It is the job that stayed with me for the longest time after it was over. You might think that it can't be worse than that, and that I haven't seen worse, but it is definitely the worst thing that I've ever felt. I never did go back and go check up on her. This happened a couple of days before my 15th birthday. I fell off a horse and was taken to the emergency room for my hurt back. Was sent home after a few days. I wasn't worried about what happened, and I went on with my life. A while later, a guy adds me as a friend on social media, tells me that they were the paramedic that day. We talked about me wanting to be one, and he helped me along. He sent me messages constantly. I hardly replied. I felt bad, so I made time to talk with him more often. I found out that he was in his 40s, and told him that it was weird he was talking to a minor. He replied that that's okay. We will be working together soon. Since he is a paramedic, he told me about my family's history with medical records. He told me about stuff I said to the doctors, so that I would just keep talking to him. Used my family records against me as well. He always drove past my house on the way to work, looked through my windows. He would always message me, telling me how hot I was doing whatever I was doing. My grandmother fell ill, and of course it was him who responded. He drove away with her. Later told me how sexy I was when I cried. I had to talk with him daily. He taught me medical stuff that paramedics have to know. A year later, I had broken down with depression. I stayed in a mental hospital after my breakdown. He got in contact with me daily while I was there. I didn't say anything to anyone there because I was scared of what he might do. The police came and knocked on my door, told me that I had to go with them. I had to sit and wait for a lady to come back. Moments later, she comes back with a lawyer. The lady told me some older guy was calling me when I slept. They thought something was wrong. One lady knew the guy and knew that he was in his 40s. I told that lady everything that happened over the last couple of years with him. They took me back and I figured it was all over after that. After a little while, he started calling me again, angry that I told them everything. He started yelling at me over the phone. He called every day until I hit 18. I went in front of the judge. I told them everything, things my lawyer didn't even know about. A cop came in, told everyone that they found child porn on his computer, even pictures of me. My mom was furious when we found out that he only got a few months in jail. She told his boss and then had him fired. When he got out, he called me for a little while. Then one day, called and said that he met someone else, and that he wanted to cut ties with me. After that, I never heard from him again. I still get scared when I see a paramedic thanks to that man. At the time, I was 17. I was wearing booty shorts and a top after going with friends to the lake. I was about to drop off the last person in my car. I pulled up to a red light. I happened to see an ambulance pulling alongside my car. When the light hit green, I hear the siren of the paramedic vehicle. I saw the driver had his head out yelling at me to pull over. I thought that he wanted to pass me, but the thing was, his siren was only on for a few moments. I was completely confused. I pulled over, and so did the driver. I became confused as he got out of the car. He wanted me to step out to talk with him. I asked him why he pulled me over. Suddenly he asked me for my vehicle information. I grabbed everything, and when I got out, I said that I didn't know you guys could even do this. My friend was getting angry when the guy looks down at him, says, "Shut your mouth, or you will be put in cuffs." I asked again why he pulled me over, because this wasn't like any other time that I got pulled over. He smiled with a sinister grin. I felt exposed because of my top showing my breasts. I covered them up with my arms. I felt very exposed. He said that he pulled me over because I didn't have a front plate on my car. He wouldn't have even seen that until he walked out of his car. I told him that I had one in the window, but he told me that I was in a ton of trouble, and he needed my information. The man talked over me, sounded very angry at everything that I said, made a huge deal of letting me go without a ticket, that I should be lucky that he was being nice to me. Thinking about it now, I'm sure that he wanted me not to suspect anything from him. He didn't have a name badge or even a partner with him at the time. I'm sure that he was hoping that me being young, I wouldn't argue with him at all. I'm sure that my friend, being a witness, stopped anything bad from happening to me that day. I went home, thinking about the whole situation, wondering what was really going on. I was living alone, and didn't really have anyone to explain things to. I calmed down when I remembered that I didn't change my address when I moved. Mind you, this was in the 90s, so there was no major database to keep track with. This is the worst medication error that I have ever seen as a paramedic. Medication errors are unfortunately a common occurrence both in and out of the hospitals by regular, competent, and incompetent medical clinicals, such as the registered nurses, doctors, and paramedics. The reason for medication errors involve a multitude of events that culminate in accidents. When you consider the long hours and chronic fatigue that most healthcare workers are employed, overall stress of the job, and night shift, it is surprising that there aren't more medication errors. This is the worst error that I have ever witnessed. We attended a lovely lady in her early 90s who appeared to be well and healthy. The registered nurse at the nursing home gave me the blister pack, which had dozens of odd medications, which had been administered to the patient about an hour beforehand. I read through the list. Digoxin, Slow K, a variety of antidepressants. All seemed relatively normal. Okay, I say. So she's had her medication today? What seems to be the problem? Well, the nurse looks at me a little sheepishly. Well, that's just it. These aren't her medications. So, it turns out that this lady has been given a total of 12 medications from a blister pack that was not her own. To make matters worse, she is allergic to ACE inhibitors. Fortunately, our patient was fine in the end. But a very simple mistake could have easily had fatal ramifications. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos, and become a stalker of the night. And I'll see you next time.